The presentation I wanted to focus on for this update was from Dr. Jackie Lee, and it was called Managing Aggressive Dogs. Now, this was a really fascinating presentation from Dr. Lee. She outlined how humans have a tendency to consider aggressive behaviour to be its own problem. And when we think about it, we can tend to look at aggressive behaviour in dogs in isolation without really taking into context, why the behaviour is occurring, what's happening. Are we ignoring the body language clues that our dogs are showing us that they're not feeling comfortable? Do our dogs feel that they need to then escalate that behaviour to something that's more obvious, like the lip curl, snarl, air snap, and then bite, or the growl, of course. Now, it's really crucial that we understand why our dogs are being aggressive or demonstrating aggressive behaviour in everyday situations. And it's really crucial because there is always a valid reason for a dog's aggressive behaviour. And Dr. Lee pointed out that aggressive behaviour may be motivated by fear, anxiety, frustration or anger. And she also further stated that aggressive behaviour is just one method of responding to stimuli. It can be very normal, but I want you to listen very closely to this next statement from Dr. Lee, which in my opinion outlines so elegantly the reality for dogs in everyday situations. It is accepted that some animals will show aggressive behaviour when threatened and when in their breeding season, for example. But when dogs are aggressive, when people perceive that it isn't appropriate for dogs to be aggressive, then it's the dog, not the people, who is considered to have a problem. That's really important because it harkens back to that point again that I mentioned about putting dogs in situations of conflict and distress and not paying attention to the body language clues that are telling us, look, I'm not feeling comfortable, I need some space. If you don't listen to me, then what do I have to do now to get your attention? I have to growl. That usually gets our attention. But really, we should be paying attention well before that happens, even though our dog's growling at us is a valuable piece of communication that we should respect. Dr. Lee pointed out that aggression is part of the normal behaviour of dogs. So I'm going to say that one again. Aggression is part of the normal behaviour of dogs. And Dr. Lee gives us an example of how humans might become angry and express their frustration with some shouting or waving their hands around. That's within normal limits of behaviour for people, but she also talks about growling and barking and even lunging and biting are completely normal for dogs to do sometimes. Now, this is an extremely important distinction that Dr. Lee makes because she went on to clarify that, of course, once again, aggressive behaviour may be motivated by fear, anxiety, frustration or anger. And these emotional states are negative. So when an animal is in a negative emotional state, they may be more inclined to react aggressively. And Dr. Lee also elaborated further by saying that it is the animal's perception of what is happening to them that's important, not what the human thinks is right or appropriate. And Dr. Lee also talked about, even though humans may not be intending to be threatening, it's the dog's perception. And she states that then, in that case, it is right and the human needs to pull back from that situation. Now, I wanted to, just as an aside, just refer you to a link that's in the description, and it's called Malignant Behaviour, the Caesar-Milan Effect. Dr. Karen Overall is also a specialist in veterinary behavioural medicine, and she made a very salient comment, which I want to link in with a point here. She made a comment: if you think you really need to dominate an animal, go home and try to dominate your cat. And after they've sewn you back together again, we'll talk. Now, I'm talking about cats, but we're talking about aggressive behaviour in dogs. But let's look at the way we think about cats and react to and behave towards cats. We know that cats can cause serious injury to us. We know that when we see a cat that is twitching their tail, is crouched, has made that growl sound, or has hissed at us, do we listen to that cat? Yes, we do. But we're not listening to our dogs. So that's a really important distinction, and just another point, another example, if you like, just to link in why it's so important that we understand that there is always a valid reason for our dog's aggressive behaviour in a given situation. Now, Dr. Lee also delved into a really insightful point, and it was outlining the importance of understanding how dogs view the world, because this is also important to understanding when they may use aggressive behaviour. And of course, we talked about the putting our dog in a situation of conflict and distress where they're not able to escape from that. But Dr. Lee also talked about the evolution of dogs being from a scavenging, hunting species that eat a wide range of foods, from fresh prey, eggs, carrion, vegetables, and also plant matter. And she points out that the habit of eating carrion and other found objects means that several dogs would gather around a carcass or other source of food. So you might be asking, well, why is this information important? Well, it's pretty important because Dr. Lee explained that wherever there are resources in restricted supply, a system has to be worked out to minimise injuries to the parties wanting those resources. And also that dogs manage access to resources on the idea of, if I can hold on to it, it is mine. And this is called resource holding potential. But what I wanted to also just quickly mention was that Dr. Lee also pointed out that dogs do not work on a dominance hierarchy, in complete contrast to what is written about them by humans. They do not work on a dominance hierarchy. Now, talking about the resource holding potential, let's take a closer look at that from our dog's perspective. So what might we see in the form of behaviour, as well as what might motivate our dog to have resource holding potential or to want to defend a particular resource that they feel is valuable to them? Well, Dr. Lee describes resource holding potential as weighing up different factors that decide if a dog will fight to hold on to that resource, and that includes the weight, the age, the size of the dog, how hungry, thirsty or tired that dog might be, also the previous experience of that dog in general with holding on to potential resources, and also the experience with challenges, other dogs or other people that the dog may perceive to be challengers in that environment where there are resources. Now, importantly, other personality characteristics like a dog's tenacity is also going to influence their motivation to demonstrate their resource holding potential. Now, Dr. Lee illustrated some interesting strategies that a dog might use to obtain access to a resource. And if you have more than one dog in your household, you might have seen this happening. So it might include feigning indifference and sneaking in to steal that resource, or even standing close to another dog and barking at them until they leave. then of course the resource is available for them. Now, after hearing the word sneaky, I'm wondering how many of you might have actually made a judgment call on dogs when you heard that word sneaky. But if we define the word sneaky, it's just a word to describe a technique that might be sly, furtive or underhanded. But when we consider again that salient point that Dr. Lee made about the evolution of dogs as scavenger species, you need food to survive, and that's a successful strategy. Now, I wanted to talk about a really crucial fact that Dr. Lee mentioned about dogs, and it's that they have limited reasoning abilities. Now, their abilities are at about the level of a 2-year-old child, and Dr. Lee mentioned that this means that they don't understand concepts such as later, or saying sorry, or the right way to behave. And Dr. Lee also mentioned that if dogs could understand these things, then they'd have to be able to think forwards and backwards in time, And they'd also have to understand how someone else feels, and they'd also have to have morals and ethics. And Dr. Lee stated that dogs have none of these. Dr. Lee provided some really, well, first of all, common sense advice, but scientific advice as well, to help manage our dog's behaviour and therefore their emotional state in everyday situations. So we are then reducing the risk of having our dog in a negative emotional state, and also them having the increased inclination to react in an aggressive way, to demonstrate aggressive behaviour. So the first thing is, when we're talking about food, let's talk about food first. That's so important. Dr. Lee just states clearly, let the dog eat in peace. Don't ask them to do any tricks. Stop handling the food. Stop putting the treats in the bowl. And I'd also like to add one more thing. Stop asking your dog to wait when you've already put the food bowl on the ground. And stop frustrating your dog by doing this. Like, how would you feel if you were actually sitting out at dinner and the waiter kept coming over, grinding pepper in your plate, and then a couple of minutes later he took the plate away from you while you were still eating? I mean, you'd be pretty justified in becoming frustrated or demonstrating appropriate behaviour to show that you were angry in that situation. So if your dog is growling when you're approaching their food bowl, and you have a history of interfering with their food when it's been put down, or you're frustrating your dog in that situation, then your dog growling at you is their way of concisely and clearly and politely warning you to give them some space. That's the equivalent in that situation for your dog. Now, another great piece of advice: if you don't want to eat it, then don't take it from the dog. And if it's something that the dog shouldn't eat, offer them something better so they'll leave that alone and take what you have to offer. Dr. Lee also talked about the importance of teaching children to respect dogs' treats and also the dog's food bowl. And if you can't do that, if you're not in a position to do that, then separate the dog at feeding time. Make sure they have a nice quiet place to eat where they won't be interrupted. Now, another point that Dr. Lee raised, really interesting. If you are only feeding your dog once a day, that can actually create a stressful environment for your dog, because it's the only time that your dog gets to eat, the only time that your dog gets to access that valuable resource. So it would be far better for your dog to provide food puzzle toys for your dog, put the total amount of food into different food puzzle toys, so your dog has a chance to eat at different times, not just at that one very short designated period of time. And that's more compatible with the dog's natural foraging and grazing tendency, if you like. Now, also, and one other very interesting point with linking in with being fed once a day. Dr. Lee said, try eating once a day on someone else's schedule and then have someone play in your food. So that's not very enjoyable, and it's pretty stressful. So it harkens back again to the human example of the waiter encroaching on your dinner time. So it's the same thing with dogs. Right, now with the resting place, of course, everybody in the household, including the dog, needs a place where they can rest without being bothered. And Dr. Lee encourages all dog guardians to provide a space for their dog. Now, when we're talking about the emotional states of dogs, Dr. Lee also mentioned that just like humans, some dogs show aggressive behaviour when they're frightened. They may growl, snarl or lunge and bite if feeling threatened. This is an appropriate response in some situations. And once again, if our dog growls at us, we all need to stop, just pull back a bit and reassess the situation. Now, just a question I wanted to pose to you. So how would you feel if you were ignored or even punished for trying to communicate your emotional state in a situation where you were feeling fearful, frustrated or anxious? So when we start understanding these facts about dogs, we start shifting our thinking away from judging our dogs, from blaming our dogs and placing unfair expectations on our dogs, and we stop perpetuating myths like that dog should know better, or that dog breed should be banned, or that dog is a menace, or that dog is dangerous, we then shift our thinking away from that because we understand that there's always a valid reason for our dog's behaviour in a given situation. Now, the sad truth is that millions and millions of dogs across the world right now are being placed in situations of conflict and distress, and this is completely unnecessary and can be avoided simply by understanding what dogs need, both physically and mentally, with respect to their health and welfare on a daily basis. So once we start focusing on that, we can then start understanding when our dog might be shifting into a negative emotional state, and we can help our dog by intervening appropriately for them and then shifting that negative emotional state into a different situation where it is a positive experience for them, a pleasant one, and the environment is safe and neutral for them.